Alright guys, so last time we talked about the United States and the Soviet Union and their two sides of the Cold War. Today we're going to talk about China and about policies of containment pretty much all in Asia. So that is the plan for these notes. When you're done, you should spend the remainder of the day, any time left, working on your SOL review. Alright, so let's talk about China. So after World War II, Chinese communists defeated nationalist forces and two separate Chinas emerged. China today remains a communist country and is a major world power. It has more money than many other countries. China holds significant amounts of debt from the United States, so that's something to keep in mind as we talk about them today. The links to the videos in here will be on Blackboard for you, so if you'd like to pause this and look at the other video now, you may. Alright, so let's talk about the two sides. In 1945, we have communists led by Mao Zedong, who control northern China, and they have the foreign support of the Soviet Union. The national side, you guys, I can't pronounce this guy's name, okay? Jiang something, control southern China and have the foreign support of the United States. And we can see, if we look at China today in the world, that clearly the communists came out on top. Alright, so at the end of the Chinese Civil War, there was support for the communists because inflation, so the increasing costs of goods and services, was very high and the economy was falling quickly. And Mao promised reforms that would give the peasants more land and so gained more support. But what happened? Mao and the communists, they win the Chinese Civil War in 1949, and Mao renames the country the People's Republic of China, and it is, starting in 1949, remains today a communist country. So what about the nationalists? The nationalists flee to the island of Taiwan, which is just off the eastern coast of China, basically splitting China up into two countries. Taiwan is very small, it's only 13,000 square miles, whereas the People's Republic of China is 3.5 million square miles. So we can see that this was a pretty clear victory for the communists. Alright, so let's talk about attempts at containment of the spread of communism in Korea and Vietnam. So, the Cold War influenced greatly the policies of the United States and the Soviet Union towards other nations and conflicts around the world. And though the U.S. never directly fought the Soviet Union, they did engage in wars with other communist countries. And sometimes when you engage in war with somebody else in order to, eventually have it get back to the person you really want to fight, we call that a war by proxy. So Korea and Vietnam are located over here. Here's Korea. Vietnam is down here. So here we have Korea, which today is divided up into North and South Korea, and here we have Vietnam. So let's talk first about the Korean War, which lasted from 1950 to 1953. So North Korea is communist, was led by Kim Il-sung, whereas Southern Korea was democratic and led by Syngman Rhee. In 1945, Korea was divided up into two parts along the 38th parallel, okay, and that's how we refer to the dividing line. That's the latitudinal measurement. And in 1950, the communist leader of Northern Korea ordered the communist forces to attack South Korea. The United States, with the backing of the United Nations, pushed the North Koreans north up through the peninsula of Korea to the Chinese border. China joins the North Koreans and pushes the U.S. back to the 38th parallel. So the U.S. moves North Korea all the way up into China. With China's help, North Korea pushes all the way back down to where they started. In 1953, there was a peace treaty signed that put the border back at the 38th parallel. And today, there are still U.S. troops that patrol the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ. And this is the area between North and South Korea where it's demilitarized. Neither is allowed to send a military in. So this was a long war that resulted in things being exactly the same, except somebody else is monitoring the border, okay? Speaking of other long wars, let's talk about Vietnam. So, Vietnam much, much longer, almost 20 years instead of 3 years. From 1945 to 1954, France was at war with Vietnamese nationalists in an attempt to hold on to their colonial holdings in Vietnam. In 1954, the Genoa Accord divided Vietnam at the 17th parallel. So, just like there was a line of latitude that divided up Korea, there was a line of latitude that divided up Vietnam right here. North Vietnam was communist, and the leader of North Vietnam was named Ho Chi Minh. Southern Vietnam was democratic, and its leader was this guy whose name I can't say. So in 1957, North Korea invades South Korea, and the U.S. supports South Korea in order to help try to contain communism and stop the domino theory. The domino theory said that if one country fell to communism, then all the countries around it would fall to communism, and it would be a domino effect. And eventually everybody would get pushed over onto the communist side. The American military intervention in Vietnam began under President Kennedy and continued under President Johnson after Kennedy was assassinated. And the U.S. strategy of escalation led to massive involvement of U.S. troops. So they kept sending more and more people to Vietnam. As part of the war in Vietnam, there were many, many landmines planted in the ground. They were never safely removed. Safely removing landmines is possible but it's nearly impossible to get all of them. And since the 70s, over 40,000 Vietnamese people have been killed or wounded by unexploded landmines that were still in the ground after the Vietnamese War, or the Vietnam War, excuse me. There was a terrible psychological impact of this war on troops from the U.S. as well as from Vietnam. There have been a large number of homeless Vietnam veterans. More Vietnam veterans are homeless than the total number killed in combat. And, you know, this is part of the ongoing issue in the United States with our government and treatment of our veterans and the psychological help available to them. We can see with this generation of Vietnam vets, what not having proper psychiatric help can do to our troops when they return from war. And this was a very, very, all wars are terrible. Vietnam was in many ways particularly terrible. Over 58,000 or 58,000 Americans were killed in Vietnam, and over 1 million Vietnamese people died during this war. So American troops rapidly defeat the northern Vietnamese forces, but they could not win a limited war. They couldn't just do it part way. So President Nixon had a plan for Vietnamization, which was the withdrawal of American troops and replacing them with South Vietnamese troops. So the Americans would withdraw from North Vietnam, while the southern Vietnamese troops pushed into North Vietnam, and they would slowly relinquish control of the northern area to the southern Vietnamese troops. But what ends up happening is that the U.S. and South Vietnamese fight against North Vietnam, the Viet Cong, until 1975, when the U.S. withdraws from Vietnam and Vietnam is unified as a communist country. So the U.S. goal of containing communism and promoting democracy was absolutely not successful in this case. All right, you should go back, make sure that you have your notes, make sure you've marked where these countries are on the maps, and then you may use the rest of today to work on your SOL review packet. All right, thanks, guys.